Welcome as we continue our study in this Bible series that we're describing as Looking for More. That is the exploration of the signs and miracles and wonders that we read about in the Gospels. Now, we've pointed out a few times already that there are many times that Jesus does miracles where we get just the kind of the generic comment about how Jesus has gone into these villages and he's healed many people and so on. Those kind of comments make it obvious then that the miracles that are recorded are specifically given to us for a purpose, that we have the detail. And we notice in John chapter 2, when Jesus changes the water to wine, John says, this is the first of Jesus' signs that he performed. And the sign is not just a miracle, but it is a miracle that is given to demonstrate, to teach, or to show us something. So we've been looking at some of these and exploring them together. We looked at this first miracle in the Gospel of John. Jesus turns the water to wine, and we saw that one of the things that we could learn from the sign is how Jesus cleanses every stain. We noticed in Mark chapter 8 that Jesus healed a great multitude with just a very small amount of food, and we noticed that one of the things at least we could learn is how Jesus truly satisfies. Interestingly enough, when Jesus was walking on the water, which is where we'll be in John chapter 8 in this section of Scripture, but in Mark 6, when Jesus walks on the water, we notice that the disciples were afraid and that there was the comment that they hadn't learned anything from the feeding of the multitude, which is suggesting there's not just the miracle to be experienced, but the lesson to be learned, or how faith is to grow. And then we noticed last study one of the most peculiar miracles in terms of Jesus's conversation. Casting out a demon from someone even without being there to physically touch that person, that's not so uncommon. We see that a few times. We saw it early in Matthew chapter 8 with the Roman centurion servant as far as healing someone without being there. But the way he talked to her, or the kind of conversation, and we looked at that and enjoyed that exploration. So if the last study was about one of the strangest conversations that Jesus has had, the miracle we're going to look at in this study is one of the strangest actual methods that Jesus uses. So let me invite you to open your Bibles to Mark chapter 8 as we'll be looking at this particular miracle. Now, one of the things that we have been pointing out is it is possible to experience the miracle and not see the sign. And so we've tried to notice also how the text shows us those problems and warns us about how that kind of blindness or lack of vision could cause that problem. So in Mark chapter 8, we'll be looking at how Jesus heals a man that's blind in verse 22 through 26. But let's look a little later in the text, and we're going to notice another example of a vision problem. In verse 31, Jesus tells the disciples very plainly about his purpose, about how he's going to suffer many things, be rejected, be killed, and be raised 3 days later. That's a lot to digest all at once, especially if your expectations are something different. The Jews would have probably assumed that the Messiah would come like David and set up a physical kingdom, run the Romans off, and all would be well. There's an example how our expectations or our preconceived ideas, in other words, what we already want God to do or what we already assume God's going to do, can even also include what we assume God can't or won't do. It's pretty easy to put God in the box and say, this is how God does and this is all that he'll do and so on. Whenever we do that, then we've created a filter that we see or hear everything, and that can alter our ability to see the sign and only experience the miracle, or perhaps even less. So expectations must always be surrendered to God's plan and God's purpose. Otherwise, as has been said, expectations then can simply be nothing more than premeditated resentment, or in this case, premeditated blindness. So watch how Peter misses. So verse 31, Jesus very plainly says this is what he's come to do. But then in verse 32, Mark says he was stating the matter plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Now in Matthew 16, in the parallel, Matthew tells us that Peter even says, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. So how do you get to a place where Jesus says this is what has to happen, and you don't mind telling Jesus, I'm not going to allow that to happen? That's not only is that missing the point, that's pretty bold. We appreciate the reasons that no doubt Peter was thinking this. He's trying to protect Jesus. He doesn't want to see Jesus suffer. I mean, we can appreciate the good motives, but still, he's rejecting exactly what Jesus said must happen. And so in verse 33 here of Mark 8, but turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan." Wow, and ouch, and etc. Pretty strong statements. Peter's actually not just missing the point, but he's blocking, or trying to block, the purpose that Jesus has come for. So Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're not setting your mind on God's interest, but man." So not tuning our expectations to that of God's sets us up to have a fractured vision or a fractured view and miss what the Lord intended. Okay, so the particular miracle then that Peter didn't see the sign is just a couple of paragraphs earlier in Mark chapter 8. And I don't, as I said last study, I don't know if I want to call this a half-baked miracle or twice-baked, or it's the only time that Jesus heals somebody and it doesn't work the first time. There's two things unique about this miracle in terms of how it happens. One, Jesus has to redo it, or has to kind of do it again. And secondly, it's only one of three that involve Jesus spitting. Now, in chapter 7 of Mark is the first time that Jesus uses spit to heal someone in verse 31 and following. In John chapter 9 is the other place where Jesus, in that case, he spits in the dirt, makes mud, and wipes it on a man's eyes who's been born blind, tells him go and wash, and then he can see. In the case of Mark 7, verse 31 and following, Jesus splits his fingers in the man's ears and then touches his tongue after spitting. So then he touches his tongue with that saliva, and then Jesus says, "Be open," and then the man can hear and the man can speak. So there's only three miracles where Jesus uses spit. But in two of those cases, Mark 7 and John 9, everything goes fine. It works the first time. So here's the miracle in verse 22 of Mark 8, the only time that Jesus has to redo it or do it twice. Verse 22, so they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus, and they implored him or begged him to touch him. Now what's kind of interesting here, they're already asking Jesus as far as how he needs to heal him. Remember we talked about the box, this is how God does things? So they're asking Jesus to touch him. I appreciate that. There's a certain amount of trust. If you just touch him, that's all that he'll need. But it is interesting that they already have a prescription about how Jesus needs to do the miracle. So they begged Jesus to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he said, "Do you see anything?" Now, the way Jesus, they asked, "Would you touch him?" You notice they didn't say, "Would you mind spitting on him?" That's not something they would have asked for. Spitting would have been a problem from a couple of reasons. It would have been considered unclean from the body standards of the book of Leviticus. It's also culturally offensive. Even today, you spit on someone, that's a major problem. You see an example of that in Numbers chapter 12, verse 14, when Moses is talking about Miriam and about how she's being punished as a part of her rebellion. She's been given that leprosy by God for speaking against Moses. Moses says there in verse 14, if her father had but spit on her, would she not be outside of the camp for 7 days because of her shame? So it was definitely a shameful thing. Job echoes the same kind of sentiment in chapter 17, verse 6, when he talks about it's as if that he's the kind of person that men spit at or spit on when he passes by. So culturally then, and we share a very similar idea today, that's a very disgusting thing. It's a very offensive thing. It's even considered a very unclean thing. There is a little piece that's interesting, another potential layer. So for the average Jew, then the assumption is going to be this is offensive, this is unclean, this is not okay. There is a piece that among the pagan cultures in Greek and Roman culture, the idea that if someone was a very powerful person, that their saliva could have I wouldn't call it healing properties, but if you could get a hold of or be exposed to that person's saliva, then you're being exposed to their power, their aura, their whatever. So there is the possibility that there's a layer here about how pagans view this, and that certainly might have something to do with the miracle in Mark 7, because Jesus is, after all, not in Jewish territory. I'm not sure what to do with that, though, because in chapter 8, this is a conversation around Pharisees and Jews and so on, so I'm not sure that layer would play very well. Certainly, at least, we have the idea that it would be off-putting for various reasons. So they didn't ask Jesus to spit on that guy. That would have been considered derisive or a negative thing. They asked him to touch him. Well, so verse 23, Jesus pulls him aside, spits on his eyes, and then he lays his hands on him and he asks him, "Do you see anything?" It's also unusual. For example, in Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus heals the man that was paralyzed, that they dug through the roof and lowered him down. And then Jesus says, "Take up your bed and go home." He doesn't say, "Take up your bed and go home. How are you feeling?" We don't see him when he heals somebody. He doesn't ask about their condition. They're fine. It's no problem. The whole point is they're healed. So, and then usually the person acts like it. They carry their bed off. They jump up and down. They praise God. So that's the other weird thing about this is, why would Jesus say, "Can you see anything?" And oddly enough, then in verse 24, and he looked up and he said, "I see men, for I see them like trees walking around." So he can see, but his vision's not great. It's pretty blurry if people look like trees, just blobs, just sort of tall blobs and maybe some colors, and he's not picking up any details. So he has vision, but it's not great. It's fuzzy. It's out of focus. Verse 25. Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored. And he began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home and said, "Don't even enter the village." So the man was healed, but it required 2 touches. It required 2 attempts in order for the miracle to work, or in order for him to have clear vision. It's only one of 3 times that Jesus spits on somebody in order to heal them, which is odd and uncomfortable, to say the least. It's the only time I can think of where Jesus does a miracle and then checks on their status, which suggests the idea, so did it work? Instead, we see tremendous confidence and sovereignty, and there's no question. Jesus said it, therefore it is. And it's the only miracle that Jesus has to go back and do again to get it right. Well, obviously, Jesus is not limited in his ability to heal. He just did that in chapter 7. He'll do some more in the next chapter. So the miracle is Jesus healing this man who was blind. But what's the sign? Why are we given this miracle? What are we supposed to notice? And now that we have slowed down a little bit and noticed some of the peculiar details, why does this guy have to have a second touch? So for those of you that are in the discussion groups, take it from here. Enjoy that discussion. You've got some questions that hopefully guide you along a path of discovery into looking more closely and more deeply at the text. For those of you that are joining us online, and of course, we're excited about our brothers and sisters there in Matador, this is going to be a great time to continue this conversation. Okay, hopefully you have your tools with you. Hopefully you've got your little notebook that you've been reading along and you've been writing questions. And this is a great text to just write questions that when you first just read through it, go, "What's going on?" And then to take your pencil and maybe underline some words or circle some words. So we've already done that to some degree as we talk through just kind of laying out the miracle. This time, kind of going along, we raised some questions. We said, why is he spitting on him? That's weird. It's just weird. And then secondly, why does he ask about his status? I don't remember hearing that. And then, of course, the oddest thing of all is what happened? Why did this miracle not take the first time? Now, to be fair, we have seen cases where Jesus doesn't do miracles because of unbelief. You see that in Matthew 13 when Jesus talks about he doesn't do many miracles in their hometown because of their unbelief. It's not because Jesus doesn't have the ability. God's sovereignty, God's power doesn't depend on our faith. In other words, when God said, let there be light, and he created the universe, he didn't need our help to do it. Whether we believe it or not, he can create it because we weren't even there. So he's not dependent on us in terms of his power or ability. But this is kind of like the conversation between a miracle and a sign. If we refuse to see the sign, why would God do the miracle? What would be the point? Unless it's an auxiliary sort of point, as far as maybe it's an expression of God's compassion. He's rescuing somebody, he's answering a prayer as far as their own suffering. But as far as the larger purpose of us drawing closer to God, learning from him, and so on, if people will refuse to see the sign, then this is why Jesus sees no benefit in doing the miracles. So if the purpose of miracles is to grow faith, if there is a refusal of faith, then there's no point in the miracle. And so that's what makes the idea of unable, because the purpose isn't to express power, but rather to grow faith. And we control that. So God isn't dependent on us in terms of his power, but it is up to us whether or not we learn anything, whether or not we grow in faith. That's our choice. That's our decision. Jesus can lay out all the evidence. He can lay out all the facts. He can show us everything, and we can look right at it and walk away. In John chapter 11, our next study together, we will look closely at the resurrection of Lazarus. And just kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but an example of fractured vision in that case is there will be Pharisees who are around those who see Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. They're not going to deny that Jesus did it. They're not going to say, oh, well, that was, he's been raising Lazarus at the county fair the last 3 months. Every week he does that. No, they don't deny that Jesus did it. So what they do is determine they've got to kill Jesus and Lazarus in order to stop people from believing. So you got to be closed down pretty hard to not see that sign. We'll explore that in our next study. But we better get into it. There's some things here in this particular study pretty interesting. All right, so there's a larger context. We've already pointed out that after the miracle, there is a problem where Peter doesn't understand what Jesus must do as the Messiah. And that prompts Jesus to say, you're not setting your mind on God's interest but man's. And then the next thing Jesus will say, verse 34, if you're going to follow me, you've got to deny yourself and take up your cross. And you got to lose your life in order to find it. We're right in the middle of this heavy context where you remember when we talked already from Mark chapter 8 where Jesus fed the multitude for the second time. And the disciples were still struggling in this second feeding about verse 4 of 8. Where will anyone be able to find enough bread in this desolate place to satisfy this people? And we're waiting on the click to happen. We're waiting on the disciples to go, well, he's already done this. He can handle this. Remember, Jesus can truly satisfy, that he's more than enough. But they haven't gotten there yet. Then in verse 11, the Pharisees come out and they argue and they're seeking a sign from heaven. A sign like, like feeding a multitude, like maybe healing a guy who was deaf and mute, maybe a woman's demon-possessed daughter, for example, maybe feeding a multitude earlier. In other words, they've been experiencing the miracles, but that's the evidence they never saw the sign because they're still asking for one. Jesus says, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. So we're getting about done, not only with the miracles, but the reason that a sign is not being given is they're not seeing it. Many signs have already been given but there's a blindness. Which is why then in verse 15, Jesus said, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Beware of the influence, the spreading toxic influence of the Pharisees and of Herod. Like what? Like not seeing the sign, the kinds of things that cause you to miss signs. Well, as we have discussed this paragraph, so we're building back into the context. So we've seen this before, but in verse 16, like the Pharisees didn't see the sign, the disciples are like, oh, we didn't bring any bread. So what Jesus just said goes right by him. So Jesus then brings that to attention in verse 17. Why do you discuss the fact you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? What's blocking your vision? Verse 18, having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? Do you not see yet what you need to see? That Jesus is sufficient, that he's more than enough, that he's the answer to every prayer, that all you need is Jesus, and everything that you need is Jesus. So he takes him down memory lane in verse 19 when he says, and do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up? And they said, 12. Okay, good. You remembered that. They remember the miracle. But do you remember the sign? Did you notice the sign? When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? And they said 7. And he said, do you not yet understand? So there was a sign to be learned in the miracle of the feeding of the multitudes. So it kind of hangs right there. Do you not yet understand? And yes, no, maybe so. We don't. Jesus doesn't comment further. The disciples don't answer. And then that brings us to verse 22. So they come to this town, and they bring a blind man to Jesus. The town does, the village did, and they're begging Jesus to touch him. That makes sense. What's interesting is that Jesus doesn't do this miracle in front of everybody. It says that he took him by the hand and he brought him out of the village. So this is going to be a private audience. This is Jesus, the blind man, and the disciples. And then Jesus spits on his eyes. Now, they've already seen a spit miracle, if that's a way to say that. They've already seen this once in the previous chapter. But in chapter 8, it's like chapter 8's a chapter of seconds, right? Because when Jesus fed the multitude in chapter 8, he's already done that also. They still didn't get it. So he heals using spit already as well in chapter 7. So this is the second time. Potentially, possibly, from what I can tell in the rest of the text, I'm going to assume that the disciples are still startled and surprised by the spit the second time. They were by the feeding the multitude, so perhaps they are by the spit. That Jesus does it in an unpredictable way. So there's an expectation of a public miracle when Jesus touches him. Jesus makes it private and uses spit. I mean, he touches him, but he adds a whole nother ingredient. So then Jesus lay hands on him, touches him. Do you see anything? Why would he ask that question? What's different about this that he would ask the status of a person that's just experienced a miracle? Do you see anything? Well, this isn't the only time he's asked that question. So you're the disciples, and watch Jesus spit, and you're like, oh man, here we go again. And then you hear the question, do you see anything? Jesus has asked that question before in the text already. Let's go back in chapter 8 to verse 18. Jesus said, having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you see what just happened? Well, of course they have eyes, but they've been blind to the sign. They've been blind to what Jesus is actually doing. And in verse 21, do you not yet understand? Do you see what I'm saying? As we use that expression. Do you see anything? And he said, well, kinda. What actually is necessary for the man's vision to be made clear? Now, there's a subtlety here, and If you have the New American Standard, that's the one I'm reading from, you'll see that. If you have another translation, there's a subtlety here that you might miss. And I'm not fussing about different translations, but these are times when having the most literal kind is helpful, as chunky as it is to read. You pick up little things. Because when the man says, well, I see men and I see him walking around, verse 25, in order to fix the man's vision, to sharpen his vision, to bring his vision into focus, because he can see, just not very well. Well, what happens if you can see, but just not very well? Well, you're going to struggle, you're going to strain, you're going to have mistakes, right? Whether you're reading something or... For those of us that have reached the age of wisdom where we have to have reading glasses, and if you don't have them with you, you know what it's like trying to look at a document. So you got to sign something or read something that you're straining at it, and you're guessing at some words, and so you're going to make some mistakes. You're going to run into things. You're going to stumble. You're going to collect bruises. You can see, but your ability to function is certainly hindered by that lack of clarity. Verse 25. Let's look at exactly what happens in the miracle, or when the sight is fully restored. So again, he laid hands on his eyes. So it's the second time. But is that when the man's healed? Well, so there are translations that say he laid his hands on his eyes and then his vision was restored, or he could see. But there's an extra middle phrase. Again, he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored and began to see everything clearly. So his sight was fully restored, as evident by the fact he could see clearly. There's a middle phrase there that Mark records, and then the large idea is intact in all of the translations, that when Jesus puts his hands on the second time, then the man can see. That's great. But there's a subtlety here that's interesting as far as when we're exploring and digging for more. So according to verse 25, when you have that middle phrase of the three, when Jesus lays his hands on him, it says, and he looked intently and was restored and could see everything clearly. That the man focused intently. So Jesus spits on his eyes, puts his hands on him, and then is telling him, can you see? Well, Jesus is standing really close to him, so he's gonna turn his head and look around to be able to answer the question, and okay, I see men, I see trees. Then Jesus reaches again and steps up to him, if he stepped back at all, and puts his hands on him again, puts his hands on him and says, nothing. Isn't that interesting? So, spits, puts hands on him. Do you see? Yeah, kind of. Jesus puts his hands on him again. And it's just quiet. In other words, this would have been great for Jesus to say, I heal you again, or here's number 2, or count backwards from 5. Something, some kind of instruction. There's no instruction. Jesus puts his hands on him and waits. And then the man looks intently at Jesus. Because if Jesus has got his hands on him, then that's going to be his field of view, is going to be Jesus. So when the man looks intently, when the man focuses, when the man zeroes in on Jesus, that's when his sight is restored. Isn't that fascinating? None of this is necessary from a technique standpoint. Jesus doesn't even have to be there. He can heal someone and never meet him and not be there. We know that. So this is intense engagement. It's very personal. And he's got his hands on him. And it's when the man looks intently at Jesus, that's when his vision is restored. That's when he can see. Now that's fascinating. Jesus touches them and he's looking around, and I see men like trees. And then when he really looks at Jesus, then his vision is restored. This isn't for the crowd, because in verse 26 he says, just go straight home. Don't go back in the village where everybody was gathered around and where everybody was wanting Jesus to put hands on him and so on. No, this is not public. not intended for the crowd. The lesson to be learned, the sign to be seen, isn't for the crowd. It's probably not for the blind guy. Is there anybody that we've been reading about in this chapter who can see, but it's pretty fuzzy? The disciples believe in Jesus. They're following him. They're committed. But they haven't fully seen Jesus for who he is. That comment that Jesus challenges them with, do you not yet see? Over the last several chapters, that's been the challenge with the disciples. Flip back to chapter 6. We covered this when we were talking about Jesus walking on the water, but let's look at some of the things that Mark's been building for us in each of these miracles, trying to help us connect the dots and see the signs. You remember when he came to the boat in chapter 6 and verse 47, walking on the water, they were afraid, and because they automatically assumed that what they were seeing was a ghost. They couldn't see Jesus. All they could see was a ghost. Why couldn't they see Jesus? At what point do they get to where, well, this is crazy and impossible, so it must be Jesus? They're blinded by fear. In verse 51, when he got into the boat with him, the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. They hadn't gotten any insight. They couldn't see who Jesus was. Because they didn't learn from the miracle of the loaves, they missed the sign. That set them up to miss the sign when Jesus is walking on the water. They couldn't see Jesus. All they could see was a ghost. We noticed in chapter 4, when Jesus was with them in the boat, and the boat was filling full of water, and he was asleep, and they woke him up, and the thing that they said, what shows us what was blocking their ability to learn, was they said in verse 38, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" When you doubt that God cares about you, you're going to have a hard time experiencing the miracle, let alone seeing the sign. That's why I said in verse 40, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Faith grows as we see the signs. What we do notice their reaction in chapter 4, verse 41, they became very much afraid, and they said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Who indeed? Now, it's easy to throw rocks at the disciples, or at least to kind of go, "Oh man, these guys are so thick-headed." But they're still following Jesus. They keep getting in the boat with him and going places. They're standing near him when they're in these fusses with the religious leaders and the Pharisees and so on. So it's not like they're blind. They're following Jesus. They recognize that he is the Messiah. Well, that's great. But let me take you to a parallel text. First let's go back to Mark chapter 8. This is where in verse 31, where Jesus is telling them specifically what he must do as the Son of Man and how he's got to suffer. And that's where Jesus has to turn his back on Peter because Peter becomes an instrument and a voice for Satan. Let's look at the parallel text in Matthew chapter 16. We've talked about how we've got to interpret the passage in the context that it's in, but it's also enjoyable to explore and broaden the view as we look at the parallel things as well. In Mark 16, you get down to verse 23, and you see that we're in the same place. Well, in verse 21, we're in the same place. We sort of synchronize here, Mark and Luke. Here he's talking about how he's got to suffer and be killed and be raised up. In verse 22, Peter rebukes him, "God forbid it, Lord." Verse 23, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan, you're a stumbling block. You're not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's." What's also going on in the context that Mark moves through pretty swiftly, here in Matthew 16, when you go back up to verse 13, there's a question that's been asked. Now, Mark includes this. So we'll talk a little bit about Matthew, and I'll come back to Mark and show you how it synchronizes. But in verse 13, Jesus asks, who do people say the Son of Man is? And there's some various answers. Well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, Jeremiah, so on. But Jesus brings it to where it has to be, must be, and that is that we must each personally answer this question. But who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Peter believes. This is not a rejection of Jesus. He believes clearly and wholeheartedly that Jesus is the Messiah. But that's kind of interesting when we talk about, well, there's belief, but whether we want to say is belief only enough or what kind of belief, he believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's fantastic. And that's what Jesus says. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I mean, this is it. This is the truth. This is the central truth. Who Jesus is. But that belief has to be personalized, not just to the big picture that he is the Messiah, but how does that belief make a difference in how I live and how I think on a daily basis? Let's go back to Mark chapter 8. So after the healing of the blind man, we get into the same spot in verse 27 of Mark as we synchronize those two Gospels. He goes out to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and he asks him, who do people say that I am? So we're in the same text. And then, who do you say that I am? Verse 29. And Peter says, you are the Christ. That's fantastic. As Matthew adds, the Son of the living God, and Matthew adds, and Jesus says, that's right, you got it. So Peter can see. I mean, he believes. So the fact that Peter believes that Jesus is the Christ, what goes wrong by verse 32? If Jesus is the Christ, why would Peter rebuke Jesus when Jesus says, this is what I got to do as the Christ? How do you do that? Besides boldness, but how do you do that? Peter isn't blind. He accepts that Jesus is the Christ, but his vision it's blurry. It's incomplete. Because he's setting his mind, according to verse 33, on man's interests and not God's. It takes laser focus, wholehearted focus on God's interests in order for us to grow. Everything else in verse 34 has to be let go of. You must deny yourself and take up your cross and to follow him. The disciples in chapter 8 are struggling with a case of fuzzy vision. And that's why Jesus says, do you not yet see? Do you not understand? In verse 17 and in verse 21. You have eyes, but can you see? And then Jesus performs a miracle as a living illustration. They're this man. That when Jesus spits, the kind of Christ he is, could create some aversion, right? Because you remember how Peter's going to act when Jesus says, I got to wash your feet. And Peter's like, whoa, I don't think so. When Jesus talks about, when he talks to the woman at the well in John 4, this Samaritan woman, and the rest of the disciples like, why are you talking to her? Or like when he was talking to the Syrophoenician woman we learned in the previous chapter, and they were like, send her away. What Jesus does as the Messiah creates in their life some aversion, like the spit, like, oh, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. I kind of wish, God, you'd do something else. See, here's my box over here. Remember that? This is kind of a box. This is kind of what I'd like you to do. He may not. And then they have experienced healing. They have experienced the Messiah. They have come to believe that he's the Christ, the Son of God. And they are following him, but they're running into stuff. They're tripping over things. They're missing the fine print because their vision's blurry. They see him, but they see him like a blob, like a tree. They don't see him well. So what do they need to do? Jesus has all the patience in the world if they're willing. For Jesus continues to put his hands on their life, and what they need to do is to look at him intently. And if they will, their vision will be cleared. All along the way in the Gospels, the disciples continue to bump into stuff. It won't be very long at all when they're going to get into a big argument about which one of them is more important in chapter 9, kind of toward the end. They're going to get into a big conversation about, well, I'm better than you are, or I'm more important than you are, which means they're looking intently at themselves. And maybe others, one another, but they're looking at themselves. So they keep doing silly things. They keep bumping into stuff. They keep seeing just blobs and not what they should be seeing. Even when Jesus is crucified, they're not going to see him clearly. They're going to be afraid and they're going to struggle. There's a beautiful scene in John chapter 20 when Jesus appears to the disciples locked away in fear. And in fact, even in John 20, when Peter and John run to the tomb and they see it empty, they start seeing. And that's why you don't hardly recognize the same men in the book of Acts. Men of great integrity and faith and strength and assurance and confidence and humility, and wow, they're like totally different. It's like they can see clearly. They don't bump into the same things. They're not perfect, of course not. But they see clearly. Because when Jesus is resurrected, they finally learn to look at him intently. That's what it takes. It's an amazing miracle. There's more layers, I'm sure, to this odd miracle, using spit and having to do it twice, for sure. In our next study, we're going to talk about the sixth sign in the Gospel of John, and that is the resurrection of Lazarus in John chapter 11. So be reading John chapter 11. Again, I encourage you to have your notebook with you and notice things and write down questions. And here's something, just to give you a head start. Take your pencil and underline or notice mark, however you'd like to, how many times John says that Jesus loved Lazarus. And sort of like the double miracle, or having to do it twice, ask yourselves a question. Why would John have to say 3 times? Did I just give away the answer? Anyway, why would John have to say multiple times that Jesus loves Lazarus? There's some things in there that's absolutely interesting and amazing layers. And we're going to see the blindness of the Pharisees, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. So read, if you would, in preparation for our study and our discussion, John chapter 11.